response. I mean, we need to think about these issues that you have flagged. And as for Roy dropping her surname, and I mean, this bit about Santram is very, very interesting. So he's born into a potter caste. One of the things that, because it is to Santram also that we owe this text in many ways. So for me, one of the first steps, it took me 6 to 8 months to write that footnote, because this information is not available on Google. You cannot just say who is Santram and find an answer. It's not in Wikipedia. There's lots of stuff here which you need to kind of meet people, translate text. My Hindi improved in the whole process of doing this, and Ajay Navaria, my Hindi has improved. Because you have to read original text, and I had good help with Julie Birdsell doing this. But Santram drops his caste name and adopts PA, the education. You know, I mean, what Ambedkar is talking about: educate, organize, agitate. I mean, that is symbolized by Santram and his partners there, some of whom Har Bhagwan. And it's so ironic that because of the surname thing, I'm just speaking a bit about it. Har Bhagwan was an associate of Santram, who was not as strong-hearted as Santram was in defending Ambedkar and continuing to correspond with Ambedkar. Ambedkar goes on to write a preface for Santram's book. This was told to me by Bhagwan Das, and without Bhagwan Das, I wouldn't have really gone as deep into this as I could, because he was an inspiration for me. And Bhagwan Das used to tell me, I mean, in his writing there was so much about those times, because he was somebody who met Ambedkar, and I could sit with Bhagwan Das and talk about it. That was my pleasure and privilege. So you could find out that this Har Bhagwan was actually a Sethi. In 1972, he writes in a journal called The Atheist, which is published from Vijayawada by the Atheist Center. And then they inform us very gently that he's actually a Sethi. Till then, there's no record of the fact that Har Bhagwan was a Sethi. So the way the thing comes back, when the atheists want to publish a note by Har Bhagwan. So this is there, and another question posed to you was of, can you be an Ambedkarite Maoist? Can you be an Ambedkarite Maoist? Is it a, because this, for Ambedkar, as she said in the earlier part of her speech, it's a society, and today she was talking about how society is the first curb against free speech, and Dalits have the best experience of this. Dalits have the worst experience of this in some ways, in terms of seeing society as the, and Ambedkar has a very theoretically strong position on how society is the real enemy more than the state. Whereas for the Maoists, it's the other way around. They're not addressing society's inequities, inequalities, as much as that imposed by the state. So that's, as he said, you know, there's so much of it, the Teltunde line. But in Suryakant's response, I found Teltunde's line as well, where he talks with, so wants us to emphasize more on the middle caste violence on Dalits, which is what Teltunde has been arguing since that, especially after the 70s Green Revolution. He says this is what has been happening. So over to Roy for a response.
I think I've spoken in this hall about this subject before. See, one of the things that I think we should think about is that what has happened to radical politics today, you know, and when you look at movements like the Narmada movement or the Maoist movement or all the militant movements that exist today in Orissa, Jharkhand. I'm not just talking about the Maoists, but the Maoists are the militant end and the Gandhians are the other end and all of that. But think back to the 1960s, at the time when whether it was the Naxalites or whether it was JP or whoever it was, what they were talking about was equality, was land to the tiller. Today, the only thing they talk about is whatever we have left with us, at least let us keep. And they've been pushed, the radical movements have been pushed to the wall, you know, and so even they are only talking about allowing those who have land to retain the land, which is Adivasi people in the forests, the mountains. They've all been pushed back. The radical movements are not talking about the landless, and Dalits are predominantly a landless people. So they are left out of that equation altogether. But I think, you know, having been pushed back into the forests from even the plains where they did exist and earlier communist parties have tried at some point, to do things like seize land and redistribute it, but they've never been. The minute it becomes about land, the state kicks in with all the violence in its power, So I think one of the problems is that I think Ambedkar faced this problem too in his time, which is that when it comes to caste, where do you pitch your struggle? Because after all, whether you take up arms or you don't take up arms, though people, scholars, journalists, all of us like to make it into an ideological debate, I always say it's a strategic one. For example, if you're fighting a dam, the dam is being built there, let's say the Narmada Dam. The dam is being built in Gujarat. You have no access to that site. The water is rising in Madhya Pradesh. If you take up arms, who are you going to fire at the river? You can't. Even if you wanted to, you can't. Similarly, if you're in the forest in Chhattisgarh, where I went and spent time, if 1,000 CRP, BSF come and surround your village and start raping the women and burning it, what are you going to do? I mean, no political party or hunger fast or anything is going to help, So I keep talking about the biodiversity of resistance, like we don't get boxed into one kind of way of thinking. I mean, look at Ambedkar, how many times he crossed the line from resistance into power, into back. He was a very nimble mover. He had that kind of brilliant mind that could do it. I mean, everybody on earth has heard about the salt satyagraha. I myself have been one of the people who, though I was never a Gandhian, I used to always say that this was such a brilliant political piece of political theatre. But 3 years before the salt satyagraha, Ambedkar led the Mahat Satyagraha, which nobody maybe has heard of, except Dalits, who celebrate it every year. But in the Mahat Satyagraha, 10,000 Dalits marched through Mahat to the tank to drink water. And when we're talking about the right and the left, Hindu right and the Hindu left, V.D. Savarkar supported the Mahat Satyagraha, but Gandhi did not. And he wasn't talking exactly about Mahat, but that same month he was saying that when untouchables must get where they want to get by sweet persuasion. But when they do a satyagraha, it's actually a duragraha, which he defined as a devilish force. So, but Ambedkar, though he could have there were two Mahat Satyagrahas. The second time around, he could have, stormed the tank again and drunk and forced the Brahmins to give way, and they could have drunk and whatever. But he chose not to, because he thought that now this is a social problem. It would be much better if he could be empowered by the law, But for people in the villages. Now, all this is sort of strategic thinking, which I think we should be careful of locking ourselves into just making them ideologies when they could be strategies, very clever strategies. In the same way, I think I've always said this. Maybe the Maoist party has its manifesto and its arguments and whoever is allowed to say whatever. But people don't play by those rules. People can be Gandhians on the street and Maoists in the forest and whatever they want to be. And this is very important, that we don't fall into a grid where you force what works in one political scape or in one landscape into another landscape. I would be flexible about those things. I don't think that I don't think that anybody can deny the immense work that the BSP has done in building Dalit dignity. At the same time, that doesn't mean that democracy is not so terribly flawed. Today we know how flawed it is. It's just been reduced to elections. It's just been reduced to something where everyone's energies get depleted, everyone feels happy, and then go back. So I think we should be able to handle many levels of different kinds of politics together, and that can only happen when you don't think like the state. When you think subversively. And I think, particularly in caste politics, it's very important to think subversively. Like it's important to destabilize and unsettle those boundaries.
Yeah, that makes it interesting because you see this Ambedkar. He starts with exhaustive engagement in the colonial state. As soon as there is talk of independence and writing the constitution, he realizes. But this is also very interesting. You can see he ceases to be subversive in those times, because the pressure of being a true nationalist is so high that everything has to be strategically worded. So even in the constitution, you cannot use the word religious minorities and so on. So he's troubled. But so maybe are you saying that the constitution was just a kind of compromise that Ambedkar made with the elites?
Well, I'm not saying it. He himself, there's a footnote in my essay where he himself says, I would burn it. He himself was very disturbed by it. But I think what was very interesting is, as this country hurtled towards independence, honestly, when you read this book, so many easy ideas, so many default positions get turned over. It's very, very unsettling, so many things. So, anyways, India's hurtling towards independence. Both Ambedkar and Gandhi are worried about what is going to happen to minorities. In Gandhi's case, he's mostly worried about the Muslim minority. In Ambedkar's case, he's worried about what's going to happen to untouchables. And yet, they both have very different reactions, Gandhi starts getting very philosophical and he says, I don't believe in the country and it's in the moral will of the people and so on. For Ambedkar, this category of the people is a very troubling one, because he knows that the people will eventually come to mean the privileged caste Hindu majority. So he's, even though he has spent so many years baiting the Congress, he actually desperately wants to maneuver himself into a position where he can be on the constitutional, on the committee that writes the constitution, so that he can put in these safeguards which he's been working on since the 1920s, which he's presented at the round table and so on. And how he gets on to it is an interesting story in itself, because though Ambedkar was he has such a brilliant mind, but Gandhi was a more brilliant politician. He was able to maneuver things in ways where he, even by the late 40s, when the Muslim-Hindu identity became more important than the untouchable and privileged caste identity, all these things were going on at a breakneck speed. So how Ambedkar came to be on the drafting committee, being nominated by the Muslim League from Bengal through the Scheduled Caste Federation, and then Bengal gets partitioned, so again he loses his place, then Nehru nominates him. And it's really a very fascinating story, because in India you had Ambedkar, who became the first law minister, and in Pakistan Jyotirmay Mandal, who became the first law minister, also a Dalit, and how they both became so disillusioned with things, you know. So the whole story is very, very fascinating, and you can, I mean, I would love to talk about just just the process of the idea of writing, you know, because unlike Anand or unlike Suryakant, I'm a writer who, meaning you're scholars and footnoters and all of that, but for me, the telling of the story was important. You know, how do you tell it? Like I want to send this book to, you know, when Richard Attenborough made Gandhi, the film, which won 8 Oscars and which is the version of the independence struggle that the whole world knows. Ambedkar didn't even have a walk-on part, you know. So a couple of years ago, I was in England for something, and I was sitting somewhere, and Ben Kingsley, who played Gandhi, came in and for some reason, you know, went down on his knees and kissed my hand. I said, "Are you sure you're like not mistaking me for someone else?" Like, I don't know why he was doing. He says, "No, no." So I want to send him this book and say, "I want you to play Gandhi again in this film." You know, and it'll be more fun. It'll be more fun. You know, but how do you tell this story? You know, because eventually everything is not about just collecting information, no? It's also about telling a story. How do you tell a story? How do you tell people who don't want to hear the story? How do you make them listen to the story? For me, these are also very, very important things. You know, it's not just that let's get a famous writer to write an introduction, no? But the famous writer is also famous for a reason. Didn't get born famous. So I mean, the art of telling these stories is what is going to change the way people look at other people. You know, it's such a deep-rooted and sickening thing that it's not the system of caste. It's not just that it has made victims of the subordinate castes. It has made victims of us all. It has made victims all of us. We are sick people until we deal with this. Like Ambedkar said, you're sick people, you know, and we have to get this out of our blood. We can't be anywhere. There is nowhere in the world that is as grotesque as this, because I mean, not even apartheid. You know, not even apartheid was as horrible as what we practice today all the time, even though we try to invisibilize it.
I just say something about this whole thing about annihilation of caste. When I started reading it and in terms of looking for scholarship around it, and you would start reading Hind Swaraj, which is considered Gandhi's most important contribution to literature, translated from Gujarati, and scores of papers, not just on that, but Gandhi, and you know, it's like a whole cottage industry around it. Every year at least 10 books. And on the use of the word Vaishya, Ajay Skaria writes a 10-page special article in EPW. I mean, he's entitled to write it, there should be scholarship of that kind. But if you just want to do Vaishya, not Vaishya, as in prostitute, because Ambedkar calls the British Parliament a sterile prostitute. So these are the kind of views which even upset Sarojini Naidu, but he refused to take it back. It continues to be printed like that. Yes, it was a banned book at one time, and then the ban was revoked only in 1935. From 1909, immediately it was banned, and then later they lifted the ban, the British government. But you know, you have such deep studies of this, engaged studies with every word, everything, like she says, you know, everything has been passed, and with Ambedkar you have absolutely, I mean, I want to ask Suryakant as to why there are...
What you're saying, the interesting thing about it is that you have such deep studies and so many biographies, and yet
none that...
total cover-up. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to say two things. Like, I spent a lot of time in South Africa, and all of you have read the story. All of us have been taught the story of how did Gandhi get his first political awakening? Because he was thrown out of a whites-only train compartment in Pietermaritzburg. This is half the story. The other half is that Gandhi was sitting in the whites-only compartment because he believed that Indians, upper caste, privileged caste Indians, were of the Indo-Aryan extraction and should not be sitting with the Kafirs. That the black people should be separated and Indians should be separated. The first political victory he won in South Africa was to get a third entrance opened to the Durban post office so that Indians would not have to use the same entrance as black people. And after that, for the next 20 years, all of it is here, so I'm not going to talk about it. All of it, quoting him, quoting his letters and his articles, things about looking forward to an imperial brotherhood with the British in Africa, fighting on the side of the British in the Boer War, fighting on the side of the British in the Zulu uprising, when land was being taken from the Zulus and people were being beheaded and disseminated, decimated. And even Churchill was saying, this kind of savagery is unacceptable. So, you're right that in a way you could say that his views on caste presaged his views on race. But actually, see, Gandhi grew up in Baroda, he hadn't been to the villages, and he went, of course, he came from this Banya family, and they must have had, he did. But, before he, for example, he experimented with eating beef and crossing the Kala Pani and all of that. But the articulation began with the articulation on race, or the articulation of what was going on with race. And it's really... Yes.
This obsession with purity and distance.
That was caste.
Kind of, yeah. There is a mix of these.
So I've written about that too, the fact that how did this concept of satyagraha begin? And it began at a time when he was constantly proposing a collaboration with the white regime, And he writes quite openly about the fact that the business passenger class, business Indians are from the Indo-Aryan stock. But then he writes openly about how indentured labor, whether they are Hindus or Muslims, are devoid of any moral faculties and they are inherent liars. And of course, later on, and I'm starting, this from 1893 when he first arrives in South Africa, and you follow what the things he writes right up to 1946. But when in 1936, Ambedkar writes this brilliant Annihilation of Caste. That same year, Gandhi wrote an essay too. It was called The Ideal Bhangi. And it's in this book. You have to read it to believe it. He believed that everybody should follow their ancestral calling. And what should an ideal bhagi be like? How he should know to examine urine and night soil and to tell the person in advance that, your stomach is not well or whatever it is, And how he should always do this as a divine calling and never think to amass wealth out of it. It's quoted here. And 70 years later, in his book, which he subsequently withdrew, Karam Yogi, Modi said the same thing about Balmiki. The quote is here about it being a divine calling, and this is why they're chosen. This is what they've been chosen, divinely chosen to do. So a lot of Ambedkar's point about there not being that much difference between what we think of as the Hindu right and the liberals is borne out in so many ways, and there are people who are sort of possessive and claiming annihilation of caste as theirs, certain sections of Dalits, but actually was written for a privileged caste audience to educate them.
I mean, to go back to that thing of why is it, see, especially after 1991, that Ambedkar century, you have a lot of interest in it, and scholars also start doing this tokenism of saying, like she's talked in her essay, Outlook will say, who's the best, they'll start doing surveys and